So now we get to chapter 2, and thus begins this process of Ahasuerus trying to seek a new queen. So he seeks out all the fair virgins in all the land, starting in verse 2, and they're collecting all of these young maidens. And notice
something of a beauty contest, I believe.
Yeah. And in verse 5, it says, now in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai. And it tells you that he's a Benjamite. Remember that southern kingdom of Judah has largely tribe of Judah and Benjamin? Well, in this case, Mordecai is a Benjamite. And he had been carried away from Jerusalem, his ancestors. And notice what he's done in verse 7. He brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. So in the King James Version, it would make Esther his cousin. In other translations, it shows her as being his niece. I think it's safe to say she's a close relative.
Yes. So Esther comes forth then. She becomes one of these fair young virgins that is being prepared to come before the king. And she was brought into the king's house. And I want you to note in the end of verse 8, to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women, and the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him. And as you read through this chapter, you see how she influenced all the people that met her. They felt her kindness, they felt her goodness, and they liked her. They were very fond of her. And then at the end of verse 9, it says, he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. So she's already making an impression. She's standing out in a very special way.
And the amazing thing is nobody has any idea that she's a Jew. They don't know her background. Because keep in mind, back then, there have been so many conquests between Egypt and Assyria and Babylon and Persia and Media and the Philistines on the far west and Moab and Edom. And it's this mixture and milieu of all these different peoples and nationalities. At this point, they don't know, and quite frankly, they don't seem to care. But there's something different about Esther. She stands out, as you said.
So all of these fair virgins are brought to the palace, and from all stations, and they gather there, and they are to stay there for 12 months. They call it purification must be accomplished, and also part of that experience for them was learning the ways of the court. They had to learn how to behave in a palace. That was a big job. So it was interesting to me that in verse 13, then thus came every maiden unto the king, whatsoever she desired was given to her, to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. So I'm assuming you pick out all the jewelry or the beautiful linens or gowns or whatever it was that they felt would make them beautiful. But in verse 15, it says, Esther required nothing. She required nothing, and Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken unto the king.
Which, by the way, Joy, this is a good point to pause and think about. The world that we live in kind of does a similar thing as what's going on here. There are a lot of decorations that the world offers us, and it's not always having to do with beauty. Sometimes it's accolades of the world, it's money, it's position, it's titles, it's socioeconomic status, and they give you all these things that you can pursue and you can put on. I love this story because the deliverer of the story, this Cinderella story, if you will, an orphaned girl who's a Jew, nobody really knows her, comes out of the blue, and she's not drawn to all of that the world's offering her. She seems comfortable in her own skin. She seems to be content with who she is. And for the young women and young men in the church today, I think that's a pretty powerful message for us, is to not seek our praise and our beauty and the things that the world offers, because boy, it's offering it, but to rather turn to the Lord and get our marching orders from Him, and to be comfortable with who we are moving forward, doing the things that are within our power to accomplish.
Well said. And my assumption is that they weren't accustomed to seeing that. And then maybe that's probably why she stood out so much, because she was peaceful and at ease with who she was and didn't need those outer things to make her feel whole.
Look at the beautiful wording in verse 17. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. Again, like you said earlier with the example of Joseph in Egypt, to gain great favor by the king, which then opens all kinds of doors down the road to save an entire group of her extended family, these tribes of Israel that are there still in exile. So he makes his decision. He set upon her head the royal crown, and he made her queen instead of Vashti. And then he makes another great feast. Wow, this king likes feasting, doesn't he?
He really does. Yes, good food.
So they all gathered together, and verse 20 gives us a hint. Esther had not yet showed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her. Mordecai had told her, don't tell them who you really are. Keep that a secret. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai like as when she was brought up with him. So here she is. She's the new queen, and nobody has any idea what her background and her nationality are.